Now, the county's going to incur an interest expense that's equal to the pension fund's target rate of return, which I believe is
7.75 in non-classified.
So the county, in effect, earns or has to pay a 7.75 interest on that, which has spurred a lot of counties. And how far is this going to go now? To do the second way that you can get rid of these things, which is to sell pension obligation bonds.
Right. Right.
5 of these 6 counties sold pension obligation bonds. They go out, they borrow money at a lower interest rate, they believe, than 7.75. They give the money to the county, or to the pension fund, and all they've done is they took unfunded pensions and restructured them into bonded debt. They changed the form of the debt, but the substance, the source is the same. It's unfunded pensions. And one of the biggest, I think, errors people do when thinking about the impact on their governments of unfunded pensions is all too often we only talk about what the pension fund's funding ratio is, and we forget that we have to, from the county's point of view and the people's point of view, we also have to include the balance of pension bonds, because a bunch of the money that's in the pension fund was gotten there from bonds, and it's still debt to the people. So there's implications of how that works. So that's the money flow that the accountants had to figure out. How are we going to report what this means to government officials and to the people? And I'll probably be flipping around here a couple of times. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. The fatal flaw. Here's the core problem with the way it works today. This is why some people estimate there's $1 trillion of unfunded pension debt in the United States. The way the current rules work is the pension expense that's reported every year is equal to what's called the annual required contribution, or the ARC. And the ARC is 2 things. It's the county share of the normal contribution. Jane's paying part, county's paying part. It's the county's payments of the UAL amortization payments to get rid of the net unfunded liability. These 2 together are what they report every year as their pension expense. You don't include pension bonds. There's a whole other thing about that. So the old rules is the pension expense is what the payment is. That's the old rule. Here's the statement that GASB made over 20 years ago. That's a fundamental statement of their principles. And what it says is pension benefits and other retirement benefits are a part of the compensation that employees earn each year, even though they don't get them until the future. Therefore, the cost of those future benefits is a part of the cost of providing public services today. But what happens is most governments don't report the long-term financial debt that's related to this, and because of that, readers of those statements, including the public, don't have the information they need to assess the cost of public services today or the long-term financial prospects of the government. They said that over 20 years ago. It took them till now to implement it. If they'd implemented this 20 years ago, we would have avoided hundreds of billions of dollars of debt in the country. And here's the fatal flaw. If it stays in place, of course it doesn't. This is Mendocino County. This happened. In 2012, there was a $125 million unfunded liability. Okay? So they started to pay amortization payments. They're going to pay off that $125 million. They're going to pay $360 million over 30 years. $235 million of interest. And so these are the payments up until 2040 that they're going to make. Now, sorry, this is a little, I'm gonna have to go back and beat my computer up. This is what happened. They had sold pension bonds here and reduced the unfunded liability to zero. These bars are the change each year in their unfunded liability. This is the balance of the unfunded liability. So that's how it grew to this point. 2 years, they actually reduced their liability. 9 years, 9 years, it increased. Here's the $1 trillion question. When did the expense happen that created the $125 million debt?
In the future.
3% at 50.
In the future.
But in terms of what your financial statement is going to tell you, what is your financial statement going to tell you when that debt was created?
Prior periods.
It was Bush's fault.
It's in the future.
I know, I was wondering if that would drive you crazy.
Looks like my nose. Remember how pensions expenses are calculated. It's the ARC. It's the annual required contribution. It's the total of the normal cost plus the unfunded liability cost. These are the unfunded liability payments. Under the current rules, they're going to add each year's normal cost to this, and that's what they're going to report these year's pension expenses to be. What that's telling us is that the payments of the debt created the debt.
Okay.
That's what our financial statements tell us, our government statements tell us, that the payment of the debt creates the debt, and that's absurd.
No.
The payment of a debt doesn't create a debt, it eliminates it. Where it happened, this is an unpaid expense. That's why the debt happened. The expense happened here.
That's right.
As this happened. But that's not what government reports tell us. And that's about to change. And it's going to, people do not realize what the impact of that change is going to be. You can, the normal cost back in these days was, in the $4 or $5 million range for Mendocino. But if you look at this up here, it should have been 3 to 4 times more. Bill Gates says the number never showed up. And so the government person never had any pain, and so they didn't confront the problems that they weren't confronting that was allowing this to develop. That's going to stop. And that's a really key. The debt's going to be listed on the balance sheet. I think this is going to be the more impactful change. What are you going to do when all of a sudden you were reporting a 3 or 4% positive margin, and then in the next year you're reporting a 10% deficit? Now, in the expenses, it's really complicated. It's going to take a lot of work to figure out what pension expenses are in the future. It's very complicated. So I've only run specifically my county's data on pension expenses. It will triple to quadruple them. And it will take what looked like margins and produce 10% deficits. And I think we're going to see that kind of a shift, because in June 2015 financial statements is when the counties have to start doing it. And I think that's the shift you're going to see when that happens. Well, now let's talk about the balance sheet. Everybody talks about, well, we need to put the unfunded liability on the balance sheet. And that's true, but there's a part of the new rules that people haven't looked at, haven't focused on. Mendocino again. This is the unfunded pension liability, and these are the normal costs. This is what was reported as the pension expenses. And this is the pension bond they sold in '97. This is the pension bond they sold in '03 to reduce and get rid of those UAALs. Okay? Remember, the expense is now reported as what they pay to the pension fund. So this year, they reported that green part as their expense. This year, they reported that part as their expense. What did they do with this?
Didn't
Well,
show it.
Bernie Madoff.
Imagine you give your kid a credit card. What a thought. And the kid says, well, I'm just spending a few $100s a month. Okay? But what he's not telling you is he's charging a few $1,000s a month. He's only paying the minimum payment. So it gets to be the balance builds up to $10,000. Kid freaks out and says, borrow some money and makes a $5,000 payment. And then turns around, and minimum payment was $1,000. Makes a $5,000 payment, still owes $5,000. Turns around and tells you he's got a $4,000 asset, a prepaid credit card, because he paid $4,000 more than he had to. That's what our counties have done. When they sold pension bonds, the amount above the normal cost, the ARC, was created a net pension asset on the balance sheets. So, probably have to sit here and wait. Yep, okay. So, there's 4 of these counties that reported net pension assets in 2011. Contra Costa, Marin, Mendo, and Sonoma. Now, they reported a total of $1 billion of these net pension assets, and that was the amount, and they kind of write it off over time and charge it pension expense, but that was the amount above the amount, the annual required contribution that the pension bond proceeds, that was the amount, boy, I'm really messing that one up. That's the amount of the bond proceeds above what the annual required contribution was. At the same time, look at Contra Costa. Contra Costa's unfunded liability was $1.2 billion, and they listed a $516 million pension obligation debt for a total of $1.7 billion of unfunded pension liability, and they said they had a $385 million net pension asset. This is your kid telling you he's got a $4,000 prepaid credit card asset. They paid more than the minimum payment, but they didn't pay off the debt, and they didn't recognize the expense. That $1 billion is going to go poof when GASB 68 is implemented. And this is the proportion. Almost 20% of Contra Costa's assets are going to disappear, because that's about what the net pension liability is. My county's worse. Around 15 to 18% of the assets of these 4 counties, $1 billion is going to go poof overnight. So that's one impact it's going to have. The second impact is what's going to be reported on the balance sheet.